They arrested a nobody, then realized she was their commander. The sentence might have sounded like a joke in the cell phone videos the men would later send to each other, a punchline to a night of bullying. But in the moment, it was a fact, at least to the three officers who dragged the woman from the shadowed gate and laughed as they shoved her into the back of the van. She was a nobody because they decided she was, anonymous by design, reduced to an after-midnight figure with a dented milk bottle in one hand and a private life they could leer at and exploit. Helena Medeiros had left home for 5 minutes. It was a small thing, almost ritual, no uniform, no ceremony, a simple errand that should have been ordinary. The night had been long at the 15th Battalion, and she was back in her house in the Bairro before dawn, only to discover the milk had run out. She pulled on a sweatshirt, stepped over the sleeping dog, closed the gate behind her, and walked toward the nearest quitanda, the narrow, fluorescent-lit corner store where the neighbor knew her face, but not the blue epaulets that waited inside the house. That boundary, 2 iron bars and a strip of sidewalk, had always been a line Helena could cross without losing herself. Inside the gate, she was captain, commander of the 15th, a person who carried paperwork and gave orders and carried the weight of men who both admired and resented her. Outside, she was a woman who made coffee and clipped coupons, who forgot to buy sugar, and sometimes, in the kitchen's quiet, cried until the kettle whistled. She liked that blur. Anonymity, for someone used to being watched, can be a kind of refuge. It was supposed to be 5 minutes, a chance to feel invisible again, just long enough to exchange a joke with the shopkeeper and come home. Instead, she stepped onto an axis where anonymity became vulnerability. They were there because this part of the Rua had officers on patrol at odd hours. Valdir had been on shift and had the kind of laugh that started in his throat and spread like grease. Ricardo was younger, knew enough to think intimidation was a shortcut to respect. Alves trailed behind, eyes on the ground, hands that hesitated, like a man who'd learned to do what others wanted to avoid trouble. Helena noticed them before they noticed her. 2 shadows against the shuttered storefront, the smell of hot oil from the fried salgados, the chatter of a late radio from a parked car. She kept walking, shoulders steady, the dented aluminum milk bottle small and heavy in her hand. The bottle had been dented earlier that week when her younger sister's toddler had dropped it on the tile. She had kept it that way, a small imperfection she found oddly endearing. "You alone, senora?" Valdir called, a question that was designed to be a net. His tone slid along the street like a rope. Helena paused the smallest fraction of an instant. The men in uniform were supposed to see a civilian and then see her, the same neighborhood, the same rules. She could have shown ID. She could have said, "I live there." Instead, she took a breath and kept walking. There was no point in announcing rank at a time when bragging might be punishment. "They're joking," Ricardo said. The young man's eagerness sharpened into a leer. "Where you going with that milk, huh? For a party?" Valdir stepped close. The van's side door creaked open like an invitation. It smelled of exhaust and sweat inside. The city was quiet enough that their voices didn't have to be loud to be heard. They could be intimate, ugly, private, and safe from witnesses. When they reached her, one of them, Ricardo, reached for the bottle and wrenched it from her hand. It clanged on the asphalt, and the dented metal echoed, a sound that was both domestic and obscene. "Easy," Helena said. Her voice was even, smaller than she really felt. She could have shown them her badge then and ended the joke. She made other calculations. There was pride in not making a scene, in closure without spectacle. But the men misread calm for weakness. Valdir's hand now hovered on her jacket.
"You look like you could be useful, huh, Captain?" he said in a tone that was equal parts mockery and threat. A name, even a hint of rank, would have ended the game. Instead, he stitched a lie around her, a possibility that allowed him to dictate terms. Helena let the word captain fall out of his mouth as if it were his to give. They pushed. It was a shove at first, the kind of rude handling that men practiced. Then it turned to stiffer hands, to a shoulder into her ribs, to the barked words that dressed an arrest. "You're under arrest," Ricardo said, with the practice of a man who had done this night after night, who knew the exact cadence to make a heart drop. "Come on, Preta, don't make this hard." The slur, light, casual, was aimed to cut deeper than the push. Helena remembered her training: control the breath, isolate the facts. She watched faces for micro-movements, the twitch of a thumb toward a pocket, the way Alves's jaw clenched. She stored details in the slow, private drawer where she had always kept the evidence of human behavior. She registered the tarnish on Valdir's ring, the cigarette burn in the van's seat, the child's drawing stuck to the dashboard. Minute things that would seem like nothing to men who needed only to feel their power. For Helena, they were staples in the ledger of memory. They forced her into the back of the van. The door slammed, and the smell of old coffee and old sweat filled the small space. The dented milk bottle lay between her legs like a fragile accusation. Her sweater clung to her shoulders with the damp of the night, and the light at the van's interior was a single bulb that made hard shadows. "Play it cool," Ricardo said, and the order was casual, used to being followed.
Alves hesitated on the threshold with a hand on the metal, looking at Helena the way someone looks at a mirror they don't want to clean. Inside, for the first time, Helena allowed herself to be angry. Not spectacularly, not loudly. A slow, precise anger, the kind that matched the methodology of the work she did every day: catalog, analyze, act. She began to check the easiest facts: time, faces, names, the van's license. She could make out the last 3 numbers through a sliver of cracked paint. She could feel the van move and recorded the route in her bones. Turn at the corner by the iron market, the bridge with graffiti, the depot's gate. Memory became her instrument, what rigid minds call observation and what the terrified call a lifeline. They did not take her badge, they took her phone. She did not scream, she did not beg. Men who used fear as currency for years presumed they had bought silence. But in the thin air between the tilt of her head and the sort of jokes they made, she was already making calculations. If she could not use her phone, there were other means. The battalion had cameras in the depot. The depot had a room where records were kept. Her keys were at home, yes, but not everything required a key. When they reached the gate of the battalion, the scene became a perverse mirror. They had her inside the building that was supposed to be under her command. They stepped through doors she had unlocked 100 times and carried her into a place the city assumed as a refuge for order. The back room smelled of bleach and machine oil, the kind of place where evidence was stored and where bureaucrats forgot to look closely. It was humiliating, a theft of identity performed under the nose of the very system she represented. A ceiling camera saw them enter. The dome's dark glass flickered with the soft red heartbeat of a recorder. The men did not think of the camera as a witness. To them it was a mute thing, a gray eye that could not judge. It sat on the ceiling like a trivial god. But Helena saw it as any tool. Her mind pivoted, not to humiliation, not to outrage, but to process. If she could not call out, she could still see. If she could not speak into a phone, she could put the night into evidence. They shoved her into a concrete cell that smelled of dust and layered cigarettes,
a room meant to hold detained suspects until someone filled out a form. They undressed some of her dignity, fingers through hair, pockets rifled, a jacket on the floor, and laughed as they planned, like men who believed the law on paper gave them a right that was not theirs to enjoy. "Come on, Captain," Valdir said. "You owe us now." The words were a contract, a demand disguised as banter. Ricardo pulled a chair close and sat with the easy dominance of the young who had learned mimicry of aggression. Alves leaned against the wall and watched, his fingers finding the seam of his gloves.
He looked at the tiles as if they might tell him the right answer. The minutes stretched. Helena kept her head bowed in the kind of posture learned from childhood. Don't escalate. Don't make the big tools come down. But as the quiet spread, she let the world enter in other forms. She listened to the small sounds, the distant pulse of traffic, the rustle of a newspaper from the administrative office, a radio in the corridor spitting out a directive about paperwork that would never, tonight, include what they were doing. Her internal list compiled itself with the efficiency of a trained mind. Names in full, approximate times, phrases that could be quoted, the cigarette stain in the van, the dent on the milk bottle that had been dented long before this night, now turned into a symbol of a small domestic life cracked under the wheels of impunity. "Tell us what you can do for us," Valdir said, the line between threat and business long erased. "You have access, don't you? People do what you say. Make a call, pull some strings." Helena let the words hang. She could call out his name, she could use the badge, the hierarchy, but the men had already chosen a way to rewrite reality. They would tell a story later, make it about pride or an attempted diversion. They might plant a narrative about a civilian who assaulted them, a story known and rehearsed. It is always easier to accuse the woman who resisted than to accept a tale of misconduct. That was the battalion's quiet secret. Reality could be shaped by the louder voice in the room. When they left her with the radio muttering and the bright hum of long fluorescent lights, they did not lock the door. That, too, was a decision, confidence dressed as charity. They left it ajar, because they knew no one would notice a woman in a back room in the early hours. They assumed, once more, their own invisibility would protect them. Alves lingered near the threshold. "You're going too far," he muttered, words that wanted to be more but failed to clear his throat. Valdir turned like a man scolding a dog. "You want to do your job or not?" Alves's hands shook just enough that Helena could see it in the way he tapped his fingers on the metal stack of chairs. For a brief second, his gaze met hers. There was something like a plea there, the shape of a man who had been taught that staying alive often meant keeping quiet. It was a look that carried the residue of shame and fear. Helena returned to him a look that did not beg, but measured. She recognized the same pattern she had watched for years, a system that trains men to put survival above conscience, and in doing so, corrodes the soul. The first hours were an exercise in waiting. Sleep slid in thin waves. Occasionally a voice would laugh, sometimes a slur that hit her ears in a new and old way. Men joked about the autonomy of their work, about how the rules included exceptions. They did not know, and perhaps would not understand, how each comment sank into her like a small weight placed on a scale where the only counterbalance she had was time. At home, an empty kettle and an unfinished dinner waited on a table, and a secretary at the battalion who did not know the extent of the night's events sat at a desk filling out routine forms. The city rolled on in the luminous gray of pre-dawn,
buses started their breathy engines, market stalls arranged their fruits like small altars, and the news cycle had not yet found blood to feed. Helena's first thought when silence deepened was for procedure. If the men intended to file anything false, if they planned to create the kind of paper trail that could bury truth under form and noise, then she needed to make sure there was a clearer trail that could not be erased. She could not rely on luck. She did not trust the same hands that had put her in the back of the van. Her phone was gone. The officers had taken it the way handlers collect a token of dominance. But she had other things. She had knowledge of the building and knowledge of how men assumed things would look the same tomorrow as they did tonight. She had the camera overhead, the blinking red light that had recorded the van's approach, the gate unlocking, the men who had crossed from exercise of power into predation. That camera would not blink away. It would hold, like a mouth with teeth, the truth of the night's events. She began to plan in the slow, deliberate way that a commander plans an operation, not the big gestures, but the small, replicable moves. Wait until the shift rotation. Mark the time the van had come in. Recall that the depot's footage was backed up on a server that required an admin override, an action she could request without drawing attention. She mapped each possible obstruction. Guzman, the major, who had a habit of closing his eyes to certain behaviors, Nunes, the colonel, farther up the chain, and the corregidoria, a bureaucratic body that might take time to stir. If she could not be the first to call, she would be the first to have the proof ready. And all the while she listened. When footsteps faded down the corridor and muffled voices argued briefly over a cigarette, she heard the names that would matter. Valdir's calls to a friend who owed him favors, Ricardo bragging about how easy it was and how proud he was of what the night brought. Alves again, sighing and mentioning a debt to be paid to a neighbor. All small elements that, when strung together, made a rope strong enough to hoist a lie. She kept count of the hours through cues. A rumble of trucks meant morning traffic. A delivery man with a stack of letters meant the day was bounded by paper. The distant whistle of a tram. The depot's fluorescent lights hummed like an unblinking gaze. Time became a tool. The longer she could keep the true record intact, the better her position to use it. They were not sloppy men.
They had rehearsed certain moves, but hubris is always a player's downfall. Valdir and Ricardo assumed their authority would displace doubt. They had forgotten that women like Helena had long lists of how to survive institutional rot. She knew where memory could attach to metal and glass. She knew the custody chain that would be needed if anyone wanted to move footage. Those chains demanded signatures, forms, names that could be documented. If she managed those modest motions, she could begin to create a counter-trajectory. By sunrise, the first crack of their plan showed in the small things. A commander from another battalion had called into the office asking for assistance with a routine traffic complaint. A name that should have been routine reached Guzman's desk in a different form. A central admin logged a missing phone linked to a commander around the hours she had left the house. The triangulation system, a dry, impersonal technology, had clocked her device as last pinging near the market. Someone upstairs noticed the discrepancy and asked lightly, "Who went out for milk?" Guzman, the major, had always cultivated an air of calm that bordered on indifference. He was a man used to deflecting escalation. He had a way of smoothing paper with the same hand that smoothed over complaints. That morning his phone buzzed with the ping in the name he expected to be a passerby. The lock-in of small administrative coincidences started to compress the night into a visible shape.
Inside the back room, the light changed slowly from the hard blue of pre-dawn to the soft gray of day. Men came and went, their jokes more measured now as the battalion awoke. Ricardo smirked as he replayed imagined versions of the story, narrating to another colleague about the captain in rags. They did not yet understand how a system that had birthed their arrogance could become the instrument of their undoing. Helena had moved from the coordinates of survival into those of action. She had a mind like a ledger, and she started to do the math in ways that require no phone. Where the cameras recorded, where the backups were stored, who could order a playback without a paper trail. She had access to certain protocols that allowed requests for footage or a record of entries without ringing an alarm. She only required a reason that appeared to be formal. If someone authorized a routine audit or check, the men who had thought themselves safe would suddenly find themselves on camera in an illuminated way. But first, she needed time alone with the evidence. She pressed her back to the cold concrete, feeling the outline of a seam in the wall as if it were a map. The dented milk bottle lay near her foot, an almost comical relic of the errands of a woman supposed to command men. She picked it up, turned it in her hand, felt the rippled metal. It was absurd and precise. The milk bottle could not, by itself, indict a man.
But paired with footage and voice, with timestamps and other small details, it became part of a narrative that didn't care for dignity. The narrative simply told the facts. Someone laughed in the corridor. A key turned in a lock. For the first time in the night, someone listened when a deputy mentioned a missing commander near the market. The system that allowed things to fester began to move, slowly and creakily like a ship at port. Helena, meanwhile, rehearsed what she would say. Her voice in her head was measured, not a public denunciation, but a clinical accounting of events. She imagined the Corregidoria's reaction, a dry, bureaucratic stomach better known for swallowing incidents than regurgitating them. She imagined the prosecutor's office, the way a prosecutor might look at a clean, logged set of footage and begin to draw lines between men and actions. She knew no single call would topple a culture. This was not a crusade of theatrics, but of procedure. Construct the chain of evidence, present it to those in charge of impartiality, force the institution to respond to what it could not credibly ignore. Her plan hinged on one small, ugly certainty. The camera above the back room had captured the van, the arrival, the faces. If she could ensure the footage could not be lost, if she could secure a copy that existed outside the battalion's immediate control, then the men who believed they were invisible would be forced into the light. Alves, who had moved like someone caught in the gears of his own life, came back and stood near the doorway. He had the look of a man who wanted to be noticed, but not involved. He did not meet Helena's eyes when he whispered, "It shouldn't have been like that." She turned her head fractionally. It didn't have to be. His fingers trembled. "They'll say you started it. They'll bring witnesses. They'll have to bring witnesses who were there," she finished, and the sentence was not harsh. It was practical. Helena did not want a martyr's stage. She wanted transparency. He was the kind of man who, if pushed, might be useful, but he was also the kind of man who could become a danger if his fear pushed him toward self-preservation rather than truth. Alves stepped back and left. The door closed softly. The room returned to its hum. Outside, Guzman moved through the corridors the way a man moves past tins of oil, with familiarity and an economy of expression. He had been sitting at his desk, feet propped on a file box, when the call about the missing phone came through. On its face, the call was a little funny. Someone had left for milk in the early hours.
When it registered that the missing device belonged to the commander, the thin veneer of routine in Guzman's face shifted. He was a man who had to reconcile the administrative with the personal, and often he chose the route that avoided unnecessary confrontation. That morning, the choice would matter. He called a subordinate, an officer used to collecting the small facts, and asked for a check on the depot's cameras. The request was framed as nothing more than a precaution. A device pinged, and they should be sure there was no incident. It sounded bureaucratic, harmless. It was exactly Helena's opening. In the back room, Helena counted the rotating hours and considered possibilities. If Guzman ordered a routine check, which he might if he took the ping as a curiosity, the footage might be retrieved by someone who had no reason to tamper with it yet. Once images were pulled and viewed by someone who was not in the small corrupt circle already laughing in the corridor, the optics would change. Men could be shamed by their own reflections. She had another calculation in reserve. If the Corregidoria were called, the Internal Affairs Division might act quickly. They had teeth, but only if they believed what they saw. A recorded playback, with timestamp, with sound, with the men who had boasted of taking care of a civilian, would be sharp enough to pierce through the usual defenses. But Helena also understood the counterforces. A tabloid journalist named Marcelo Varela, hungry for a scandal and more likely to trade in rumor than truth. Deputado Bastos, who lurked in the political machinery and could make trouble for anyone who upset an election season calculation, and the more insidious threat of quiet revenge. A car with flattened tires, a file lost at a crucial moment, a whisper campaign that accused her of staging the whole thing for publicity. She had no illusions. Money and power could grease gears in ways that evidence alone sometimes could not. Her move would have to be precise and public, administered in legal and procedural steps that left little room for reinterpretation. Within the small concrete room, she began the preparation. She made an inventory in her head of what could be compromised, the van's plate numbers, the sequence of entries in the logbook, the content of the corridor cameras. She drew a mental map to the room where the surveillance server sat, an administrative hub behind a locked door. She knew that copying footage from a server required an account and a device. Not her phone, certainly, not something traceable to her in a simple sweep. She would need a physical medium and a plausible reason to request playback. She weighed the options, each one a stepping stone across a stream with predators waiting in the water. There was risk in everything, but there was also a way to minimize it. She would wait until the men were distracted by the sun and the routine. Then she would move. By mid-morning, the depot's calm was frayed. The men who had thought themselves comedians trailed into administrative tasks, and the absurdity of their conquest faded under fluorescent lights. Another officer walked past the back room and frowned. Guzman himself, now nudged by the rising administrative chatter, decided to check the log.
He thought of disciplinary paperwork. He thought of protocol. He did not yet think of scandal. Helena listened to their footsteps as if they were a beat chart. She could hear someone keying a radio from a distance, someone else scoffing at the coffee offered on a counter. Her patience was not a surrender, but a strategy. She had hours, perhaps minutes, to position herself. When the knock came at the door, she did not pretend surprise. It was the predictable knock of men who had finished the preliminary acts of a crime and were moving to clean up. The door opened an inch. "A visitor," one of them said, and the voice was a mix of casual and possessive. Helena met the gaze of the man in the frame. The sunlight from the corridor washed into the room like evidence. She did not flinch. She fixed her plan in the quiet core of her mind and waited for the moment when the record would be being written not by them, but by the many eyes that watched from screens, from offices, from the Corregidoria.
She thought for the first time in hours of the milk bottle in her hand, the absurdity of the object, the small human domesticity it represented. It seemed ridiculous and sacred at the same time, a symbol that the indignities of power had come for something small and ordinary. She kept it close, a tactile anchor to the life that had been interrupted. The corridor light shifted, a boot tapped past, the radio sputtered white noise and then fell silent. The men were moving into the daytime routines. Somewhere upstairs, an admin was about to type a request. The gears of bureaucracy creaked, and Helena felt the subtle torque of possibility. She had a final mental checklist, a set of small steps she would take when opportunity opened. Secure a copy of the footage, get a witness who owed a debt of conscience, call the Correggidoria and say precisely that footage existed and it needed immediate preservation. She rehearsed the phrasing that would put the right people on alert without giving time for the men to sanitize the scene. The door opened wider now. Valdir's shadow fell into the room. He had the casual, predatory smile of a man who had always believed consequences were for other people's missteps. Ricardo hovered behind him, a boy playing at cruelty. "Ready to pay up?" Valdir asked, the old joke dressed as threat. Helena felt the room contract. She tightened her grip on the metal bottle until the metal bit her palm. She was no longer merely a woman collecting a few minutes of anonymity. She was a commander who had been thrown into the precinct's backyard like trash, and she understood the economy of what was now at stake: honor, career, precedent. The act of exposing them would not be the end, it would be the beginning of a long campaign to save a battalion's soul. She stood, the movement small but deliberate. She looked at them not with fear, but with a calm that had been earned in nights of paperwork and the slow, patient work of leadership.
"Sit down," she said, voice steady. "Tell me what you're going to tell when I get out of here." They laughed at the request, stupid and high, and in that laugh was hubris the size of a city block. They believed in the power of the moment, in the safety of their collars and the dark. Helena let them laugh. Inside, she began to plan the first move of her counterattack, a move that would use the very mechanisms they assumed would protect them. The plan was small, bureaucratic, legal, and, for that reason, dangerous. She would not charge into the street with a banner. She would work the channels, the ones that demanded receipts and timestamps and signatures. She would make the fact of the night too inconvenient for the institution to ignore. Outside, Rio stretched into a morning that would know nothing of the violence that had occurred in one of its police rooms. Buses pulled into stops. A vendor set up a cart and arranged coxinhas under a flapping blue tarp. The city did not yet know that a commander had been humiliated under its skin, and that humiliation might, in the end, reveal more than the men had meant to hide. There was, of course, danger. The men could lie. The men had friends. The men had ways to make a lie plausible, a witness here, a forged sheet there. But Helena had a different weapon, evidence that began inside a camera's black eye. She waited for the next step, the hinge on which the night would turn. It came in the form of a slip of paper pushed through the door by a junior clerk who had been sent to check inventories. He did not know the weight of the paper. It was routine, something about an order for supplies. He did not intend to be anything more than an administrative courier. To Helena, however, the paper was a deliverable, a proof that people were in motion upstairs, people who could be moved to look. She reached for the paper as he handed it in, and their fingers brushed. The clerk's eyes flickered with the confusion of someone who could tell the difference between what he was asked to do and what he had actually seen. He had not seen anything yet, but he had the possibility of seeing. For a breath,
The shape of the day tilted. Small choices accumulate. "Can you ask the admin to run a check on the exterior cameras?" Helena said quietly, enough that the men in the doorway would not parse it as a command, but loud enough that the clerk heard it. It was an oblique maneuver. She framed it as concern for municipal safety, something bland and bureaucratic. The clerk nodded and walked away. A few minutes later, Guzman's assistant poked their head in, asking for a signature on a fuel form. He glanced at the back room, at the concrete. He did not notice Helena's command presence behind the somber bowl of fluorescent light. He filed the form and left. Those were the small stitches she required. She needed a pair of hands to request the footage, hands that were not in the cabal of Valdir and Ricardo.
She needed the server's log to show that an outside audit was demanded. If a chain began outside the circle of those who had harmed her, the men would not be able to scrub the record clean without calling in a force that would create noise that would be noticed. Time, that slow currency, had begun to convert into possibility. The clerk returned with a bored expression and said the admin had said, "Give us 5 minutes. We'll pull the external camera logs and see if there's anything odd." The man left. The words dropped like a small stone into the room. Valdir's expression changed. The arrogance faltered just for a precious second. He saw the risk without entirely seeing the remedy. "You expect us to be worried about a camera?" he scoffed, but his voice had lost its earlier lightness. Helena's eyes narrowed in the way commanders learn to do when they have to be gentle with a crew still learning to follow orders. "I expect the truth," she said, "and I expect those who took liberties to account for them." Ricardo bristled. "You should be thanking us for keeping the streets safe." "Thanking you?" The question hung, crystalline. "If you wanted thanks, perhaps you should have done your job within the law." The room had shifted from cruelty to cross-examination, from raw dominance to argument. It was a change powered by the tiny bureaucratic motions that Helena had set in motion, gestures as gentle as turning a key in a lock. At that moment, a door slamming in the corridor sounded like a gavel. A paper trail had begun. An admin farther up the chain had made the request. The camera had started to be consulted. Helena felt the air tighten with a strange electric charge, the sensation a soldier gets when they know a battle is imminent. She allowed herself, for a flicker of time, to imagine a screen somewhere with the van's arrival a little while ago and the men laughing in a sequence that could now be frozen and replayed to anyone willing to watch. She could almost see the grainy replay, the gate opening, the van idling, the 3 shadows stepping, the bottle clanging on the pavement. The image, inert and indifferent, would not interpret their laughter as courage. It would only show what it had seen. The clerk returned, this time with a message that made even Valdir's mouth tighten. "They want to preserve the footage for review," the clerk said, his voice a little less bored. "Corregidoria's office has been notified." The words were small and bureaucratic, but their reach was long. Corregidoria, the Internal Affairs Division, was an entity that could not be easily shrugged off. They had teeth, protocols, and a different set of interests than the small local pride of a few officers. The mention of them changed the tenor of the room. Laughter thinned like fog. Valdir's jaw worked. Ricardo moved closer. Alves looked at the doorway as if it held both threat and escape. The men had believed themselves sovereign in a place where they had a reputation for getting away with things. The phrase corregidoria tugged at their armor. It did not guarantee anything. The institution could be slow or ineffectual, but it was a start.
It was a thread that, if pulled at the right place, could begin to unweave what they had knitted that night. Helena sat up straight, the plan crystallizing. Her face was a map of calm that had been earned in years of careful, low-profile work. She felt the possibility of leverage as if it were a warm thing in her palm. Her grip on the dented milk bottle tightened and then loosened. She set it down near her boot like a relic. She had not wanted this fight to be public. She had not wished to become an example, but the opponent had chosen the terms of escalation. They had tried to shape the narrative by reducing her to nobody. She would use the institution's own instruments to force them to acknowledge what they had done. There would be consequences, political pressure, a tabloid feeding on half-truths, perhaps a deputy with a rent to pay, and a camera crew hungry for scandal. There would be reprisals in the quiet hours, and sabotage that would masquerade as incompetence. But a beginning had been made. Evidence had a brutal way of opening doors when it was visible to the right eyes. The men stood shell-shocked as the administrative instruments started to move. A pair of hands that had once been confident now trembled with the realization that the world could be less forgiving than they had hoped. Helena did not smile. She was not joyous. What she felt was a disciplined satisfaction, the same sort that a surgeon might have when a plan comes together mid-procedure. She had been under, not above the system. She had been reduced and then slowly reclaimed. The fight, she understood, was not a single battle. It would stretch on like the paperwork in the files and the scrawl of a name in a logbook. It would be long and it would hurt. But for the moment, the tide shifted. The corrugated floor seemed less like a stage for humiliation and more like a place where truth had a chance to stand up. At the threshold of that change, with men who had believed themselves untouchable and a bureaucracy that had begun, nervously, to stir, the night tilted toward exposure. A clerical handshake became the hinge. An assistant filed a routine request that read in plain language as a technical check. Someone in the corridor logged in to a workstation and clicked a folder titled Deposito Cameras. A small blue icon next to a file flickered green as playback began somewhere up the chain. The grainy footage spilled from the server like a secret released. A black van idling at the curb, 3 figures stepping out, the crash of aluminum, the shove against a woman who had come out for milk.
Voldir's laugh, muffled and obscene, came through the speakers in a thin ribbon of audio. Ricardo's practiced cadence of "You're under arrest" sounded absurd against the image of the dented bottle rolling on the pavement. The camera did not interpret motive or intention. It only showed what had happened. That faint, merciless objectivity was all Helena needed. Her plan had not been a dramatic seizure of control, but a careful gearing of the institution's own machinery. She did not brandish a badge like a hammer. She used the archive that all institutions keep: logs, timestamps, backup copies. She had asked, by phrasing a request as a municipal safety concern, that someone outside the immediate circle run a check. The check had come back with a blurred slice of truth. The corregidoria's name had been spoken in the corridor. The word itself carried weight. It summoned a different audience to the scene. Within 30 minutes, an officer from Internal Affairs arrived at the 15th. He moved like someone who had learned the choreography of being slightly outraged but deeply procedural. He asked for copies. He recorded who had requested the check. He made notes about chain of custody. These were the brutal, dull things that could make a rumor hard to sustain. Voldir and Ricardo shifted from swagger to calculation. They spoke in clipped phrases to one another. "We can fix this."
and at times their voices betrayed panic thinly held. Alves retreated, his face a map of indecision. He had one clear choice in front of him: to sink with the group or to find a fragile line back to conscience. In the hall, Guzman hovered like a man watching a small fire lick at a curtain he had always meant to ignore. He made a phone call to Colonel Nunes, a cautious message about an incident, and tried to frame it as a routine disciplinary matter, but the tape had teeth. Helena, hands still smelling faintly of milk and metal, had not been idle. She spoke with the Corregedoria officer, calm, precise, the voice of someone trained not to show panic. She asked for the footage to be preserved, for the van's log to be copied, for the names of all those who had been on duty recorded. She insisted, not as a plea, but as an order within the chain of command she embodied. She did not demand grand gestures, she demanded procedure. For the record, she said, and the sentence folded into the room like a surgical instrument. Everything that was recorded tonight must be preserved. I will give a formal statement. Notify the Ministerio Público if it's necessary. The Internal Affairs officer scribbled the obligations down like a list he could not ignore. Corregedoria had a protocol. Whether it would be activated swiftly or delayed by politics was another question. The use of the word Ministerio Público, the prosecutors, meant the case might gain a different gravity. Names that had been a private currency in the back room became formal signposts on a path that could not easily be erased.
Outside, the battalion's courtyard carried a different energy. Officers who had been sleeping through the night now clustered in small groups, whispering, mouths forming the words captain and deposito like something foreign. Word traveled by foot and text, and in a city like Rio, the rumor of scandal spreads at the speed of human curiosity. Someone pulled out a phone and typed a short message. "There's footage." Another replied, "Corregedoria is here." Marcelo Varela got the same messages as everyone else. For him, the news was a kind of currency, fast, salacious, convertible. He phoned the battalion's public relations line and asked first, with less curiosity than appetite. When one of Helena's subordinates answered, flustered, Marcelo's voice slid through the receiver like someone who smelled blood in an oily market. He offered a blank promise. "If anyone wants to tell this from our side, call me, exclusive." His instinct was to get the story before it cooled, to convert rumor into clicks. Helena anticipated the tabloids. She had seen the mechanics of character assassination enough times to know how quickly a narrative could be spun away from facts. She did not move to suppress information. Instead, she prepared to flood the channels with verified facts in a controlled way. She called a lawyer she trusted, a woman who had handled internal affairs before, and set in motion a simple plan: preserve, document, present. Evidence first, commentary second. If the press wanted to rush, she would beat them to the verifiable record. The Corregedoria's officers walked cell block to cell block with a procedural calm that belied the afternoon's turbulence. They interviewed, they took statements, they recorded the men in custody, not the theatrical kind, but the practical detaining that meant a formal entry into an investigative log. Orders were murmured about immediate suspension pending investigation, administrative acts that could be executed without pronouncing ultimate guilt. That, in itself, was enough to change the balance. Men who had laughed in the dark were led away in handcuffs that clipped the jangle of things they had sworn to control.
The press came in waves. Small trucks with satellite dishes parked outside the battalion. Lights bloomed in the patio as journalists in reflective vests pressed microphones toward a statement. Helena listened as the first cameras trained on the gate. She allowed herself the clinical composure of someone who knew the value of timing. She had not sought the spectacle of the cameras, but recognized their utility. Public light could be a protective tool. It could also be a weapon to swallow nuance. She chose, carefully, where to place her voice. When the cameras focused, she walked to the press area with the measured steps of someone who had walked corridors of command and courtrooms of paperwork. She had a prepared statement, short, precise, and legally cautious.
Her words were chosen to emphasize procedure and evidence rather than outrage. "Today, an incident occurred at the 15th Battalion," she said. "Footage exists that records the events. Corregidoria has been notified. I will cooperate fully with any investigation. The integrity of this institution is at stake, and I will not allow abuses of power to go unexamined." Her voice did not tremble. The sound of it was not triumph, but an ironed calm. Reporters crowded forward with questions. A dozen microphones punctured the air like small reproaches. "Are you pressing charges? Were you assaulted? Will the officers be punished?" She answered in a way that gave the public the essential facts while resisting the pull of sensationalism. She framed the problem as institutional, not personal. That framing mattered. It turned a humiliating private act into a public issue about accountability. The footage itself became the reluctant star. A grainy segment of the van idling, the shove, the laughter, shown on a loop at the Corregidoria's request, was enough to force public recognition that some version of the night's events had been captured. The images were not decisive in the legal sense. They required corroboration, statements, the context that only a full investigation could render. But they were visible, and visibility is a powerful constraint. Marcelo Varela, sensing the new tide, tried his angle. He phoned various contacts and ran a piece that hinted at a strange night and internal disputes at the 15th. His tone was suggestive rather than factual. He fed rumors and waited for clicks. Helena knew the game. She also knew that tabloids like Varela's thrived on the ambiguity of half-truths. She maneuvered instead to anchor the narrative with respected outlets, those less interested in spectacle and more in verified reporting. She gave one extended interview to a reputable investigative reporter who had the patience to listen, verify, and then publish a story that quoted police records, the Corregidoria's notices, and corroborated on-camera footage. That move slowed the tsunami of gossip. When a credible outlet lays down a careful account, it constrains the tabloid's ability to substitute fiction for fact without getting called out. Helena used institutional language as armor: administrative suspension, correctional custody, preservation order. The legalese sounded boring and procedural, but it was what made the assertions difficult to overturn with pure bravado. Inside the battalion, consequences multiplied. Officers, once free to act as they pleased, now found themselves questioned in rooms without laughter. Guzman, who had tried at first to wrap the incident in routine paperwork, found himself answering more pointedly about what he knew and what he had allowed. His defenses were tested. Colonels and higher-ups received messages from the Ministerio Público asking for documentation.
Deputado Bastos heard the rumblings of scandal and smelled a political surface to ride. He issued a cautious public statement about due process, a choice that signaled more self-interest than solidarity.
His presence in the unfolding story meant the fight would no longer be contained to an internal inquiry. Politics could now curve around the case like a second, more dangerous tide. The arrested officers, Valdir and Ricardo among them, were not instantly convicted in the court of public opinion, and neither was Helena granted immediate vindication. Administrative suspension and detention are not judicial conclusions. The legal arc would be drawn out, and the DNA of such cases often included protracted investigations, denials, and appeals. The record would fill with forms and hearings. Helena had expected as much. She also knew that the first, most necessary thing had been accomplished. The incident had been recognized, and the tools for formal inquiry were in motion. But publicity creates its own ecosystem. Marcelo Varela, unmoored by the careful reporting elsewhere, turned to rumor and innuendo. His pieces suggested that Helena might have engineered an exposure for personal glory, that a captain who wanted attention had staged a scene. He chased sources willing to say, anonymously, that the footage was ambiguous. Small side channels amplified his hints into headlines. Social media, hungry for simplification, split the view into camps. Some hailed Helena as a hero of accountability. Others echoed the tabloids' questions. Helena did not respond to every insinuation. Instead, she deployed another kind of strategy: documentation and deterrence. She compiled a dossier, the server logs, timestamps, witness statements from the clerk who had pushed paperwork through the door, and the backup copies the Corregedoria had preserved. She placed these in the hands of a prosecutor who had a reputation for taking institutional abuse seriously. She also ensured that a reputable newspaper had a copy. Transparency, controlled and methodical, was her defense against rumor. Alves, the hesitant witness, had watched his comrades fall and then been confronted with the ethical ledger. He sat in a quiet room with a counselor from Corregedoria and told a different story than the one he had internalized for years. He admitted watching and not intervening, described the jokes and the tone, and provided a small but significant corroboration of the timeline. His testimony was not heroic fireworks. It was the quiet rupture of a man turning from complicity to remorse. In a legal and human sense, it mattered tremendously. Not all the allies were open. Some officers closed ranks. Loyalty, in their code, meant silence. But a small cluster emerged, Cabo Andrade among them. He had a loyalty to Helena born of years of working under fair orders. Andrade volunteered to help ensure the chain of paperwork remained intact. He walked administrative corridors, nudging files, asking for formal preservation with the quiet insistence of someone who believed the institution could do better. For Helena, these small acts were as crucial as the loud ones. They were the scaffolding of change. The battalion's inspectors met, papers were filed, and the Corregedoria scheduled formal hearings. The men arrested that night were held for preliminary investigation. Whether they would be tried or convicted at some future date remained indefinite. Institutional processes move at their own pace and are shaped by politics and proof. Helena refused to elide that ambiguity with triumphal language. The public had seen arrests and suspensions. Beyond that, the legal future was uncertain. She insisted on the truth of the present. The men had been taken from positions where they could exercise power without scrutiny, and that, for now, was a correction. Outside the precinct, repercussions followed predictably but bitterly. Someone vandalized Helena's car with a message scrawled in paint. Shots were fired at a patrol vehicle in a nearby sector in an act that read like intimidation rather than direct revenge. A dossier went missing from the 15th's administrative office one night. No smoking gun, only the nagging impression of sabotage. The men who had been humiliated by public gaze did not disappear quietly. They used the tools they had left: rumor, pressure,
disruption. The political sphere moved too. Deputado Bastos suggested an inquiry into processes and rights that could be read as a way to deflect momentum. He arranged for a televised meeting where the question of due process would be discussed in a language designed to rehearse doubts. Marcelo Varela amplified the event, calling Helena's actions controversial. The tabloid fed an audience that wanted scandal and certitude more than nuance. Helena responded not with outrage, but with more procedure. She authorized her legal counsel to file restraining actions where threats became explicit and to document instances of sabotage for use in future hearings. She worked with the Ministerio Público's office to secure witness protection for those who feared retribution. She did not try to silence the tabloids. She made the record so clear that manipulation of facts would be more evident than not. There were quieter, more humane costs. Her family felt the glare. Her sister received anonymous calls. Her home, once a sanctuary, became a target for whispered speculation. The dented milk bottle, which had been a symbol of a simple errand, sat on her desk like a small monument to indignity and resilience. Helena would pick it up on some nights and feel the weight of the campaign ahead, not a single public climactic victory, but a series of administrative and social fights. Months lengthened into a rhythm of inquiry and counter-inquiry.
Guzman found himself questioned about what he had known and when. Colonel Núñez, who had initially moved to keep a lid on escalation, felt the institutional pressure to respond publicly. He issued a statement promising cooperation with the investigations. That kind of public posture was, for now, the measure of official concern. The Corregedoría produced a report that documented irregularities in the way shifts had been recorded on the night in question and recommended further investigation. The Ministerio Público opened a preliminary inquiry. All of these actions moved the story from rumor into institutional record. The media ecology continued to shift. Marcelo Varela, in his hunger for a counter-narrative, tried to publish a leaked witness statement that accused Helena of staging the events. The paper's piece had the rough edges of a source they could not verify, anonymous claims, and overheated language. Helena's legal counsel responded with a measured letter demanding verification of sources and reminding the outlet of libel laws. More importantly, the dossier she had released to reputable outlets made a strong counterpoint. When a respected newspaper fact-checked the tabloid's claims and found holes, Varela's piece lost momentum. He adapted, as tabloids do, to another angle. The smear never disappeared completely, mud sticks, but it lost the quick, shattering force the tabloid had hoped for. Reprisals, however, were not confined to headlines. In the months after the exposure, operations in nearby districts reported equipment failures at critical moments, and a few patrols found their radio dispatches jumbled by interference. Anonymous tips were phoned to upper-ups claiming irregular command practices at the 15th, hunting for an administrative basis to remove Helena. A neighbor's car tires were slashed. The campaign of attrition was both small and cruel, enough to unsettle, but not enough in the short term to dissolve the institutional record. Helena adapted. Her strategy was not grandiose, but meticulous. She met with local commanders and community leaders to explain how the battalion would reclaim trust. She opened some operations to civilian oversight, allowing neighborhood associations to witness scheduled community patrols. She instituted a tighter chain of custody for evidence and a clearer procedure for civilian complaints. Small reforms that would be cumbersome for those who preferred opacity. These moves were not purely moral. They had tactical power. Transparency makes corruption harder to hide. And she cultivated allies in careful, deliberate ways.
Cabo Andrade and a handful of others who believed in a professional, accountable force stood with her publicly, speaking about values and duty. Their voices mattered in a culture where solidarity could be weaponized. When uniformed colleagues defended a standard rather than a person, it changed the tenor of debate.
There were days when Helena felt the fatigue of the long work, the small, wounding tasks of filing, of responding to journalists, of giving deposition after deposition. Yet she found on the desk, beside a stack of forms, the dented milk bottle, sitting like an object lesson in resilience. It reminded her that the face of abuse had been something ordinary, that the men had tried to reduce her to a domestic errand, and that this trivialization had become, ironically, the focal point for large institutional accountability. Alves, having given his statement, faced his own aftermath. He was reassigned and underwent disciplinary review. He wrote a letter to Helena, short, apologetic, not seeking absolution, but acknowledging mistakes. The letter read like a small confession and contained the language of someone who had started to learn the costs of silence. Helena did not respond with triumph. She replied with a short note asking him to participate in any inquiry that required his testimony. She understood that rehabilitation, if it came, would be a slow institutional process. The men who had been arrested faced internal hearings. Their future in the force was uncertain. Administrative measures had been taken, but the law's arc remained slow and, in many cases, shaped by variables beyond one captain's control. Helena refused to nationalize victory where it did not yet exist. Instead, she emphasized that the system's response had altered the public calculus. Abuses that might once have been shrugged off now required explanation. That shift, she believed, was durable. Public sentiment, for a time, rallied around the question of institutional reform. Community meetings filled with people who had been wary of the battalion's reputation. Some offered testimony of other instances where they had felt mistreated. Others resisted, fearful that an ongoing scandal might hollow out the institution and make neighborhoods more dangerous. The debate was messy and sometimes painful. Helena insisted that accountability and public safety were not binary opposites, they were complementary. Without trust, she argued, policing cannot be legitimate. That message resonated with some and angered others. It was the seed of the longer fight she had anticipated. Politically, Deputado Bastos's maneuvers continued. He called for hearings, for a review of procedures, and, in doing so, revealed that power could be used to shield or to pressure. He portrayed himself as a defender of due process, but his interventions read like attempts to shape the narrative for political gain. Helena kept to facts, refusing to be baited into performative disputes that would distract from the work of documentation and reform. The tabloid war eventually faded into a background hum. News cycles moved quickly in a city of many tragedies and delights. But small bureaucratic reforms took hold. The corregidoria's recommendations were circulated. Some officers were disciplined. Some were transferred. Whether those measures would be sufficient to transform a culture rooted in tolerance for abuse was a question without an immediate answer. Helena had always known this. Her goal had never been to stage a single victory, but to begin a process where deeds, not bluster, would shape behavior. In the quieter moments, beyond the cameras and the public statements, Helena walked the corridors of the 15th with that same measured step she used to make when giving orders. She met with social workers, with neighborhood leaders, with young officers hungry for a model that combined toughness with respect. She encouraged training that emphasized accountability and human dignity.
She insisted that complaints be taken seriously and followed up with documentation. She made it harder for men to hide behind routine or tradition. The milk bottle remained on her desk. Sometimes she would pick it up and turn it over, feeling again the scraped metal edge. It was ridiculous and solemn at once, an absurd relic of a night that had pushed her toward public fight. It was also a daily reminder that the work ahead would be slow and intimate, a file preserved here, a witness interviewed there, a policy amended with careful language. Small things stitched together become durable change. Months later, at a modest ceremony for a community outreach program Helena had insisted on establishing, a woman from the neighborhood thanked her quietly for taking the case public. "You could have stayed silent," she said. "You didn't." Helena accepted the gratitude with a transparency that looked like tiredness and steadiness. She knew the price: harassment, threats, smear attempts, and the drain of protracted legal battle would likely continue. She had accepted that. She had also accepted the responsibility of turning a personal indignity into a structural conversation. The men who had laughed in the dark were, for the moment, out of power. That removal was not a full victory, it was a necessary pause. The deeper work, changing hiring practices, the culture of silence, the informal rewards that once favored men who could intimidate, remained ahead. Helena had no illusions about the scale of that fight. Accountability, she had learned, was a campaign rather than a single triumph. On a humid Rio afternoon, after a long meeting with legal counsel and a quiet call to her sister, Helena walked the short distance home without the milk she had once gone to fetch. The grocery run no longer seemed like a small domestic errand. It was a microcosm of visibility and vulnerability. She climbed the gate and, once inside, placed the dented bottle on a shelf in her office, near a stack of case files and a small framed photograph of a patrol team she had once led. She did not celebrate. She did not dance. Her face was not triumphant, but determined. The arrest that had once treated her as a nobody had revealed instead the cost of institutional rot and the possibility of resistance.
The men who had reduced her to a late-night errand had miscalculated. They had opened a door to scrutiny. In doing so, they had made visible the habits that protected them, and in making them visible, they gave others a way to hold them accountable. There would be more hearings, more attempts to discredit, more nights of listening to small noises outside her car. There would also be small victories, a new protocol here, a witness willing to speak there, a young officer deciding to refuse the old code of silence. Helena understood that the work of reform was incremental and often thankless. She measured success differently now, not by the fall of a man, but by the tightening of a procedure, by the recording of a call, by the preservation of a file that could not be erased. As dusk settled over the city and the distant lights of Rio blinked awake, the dented milk bottle sat on her desk as a symbol neither of defeat nor of easy triumph, but of the odd, stubborn persistence of ordinary life. A captain had walked out for 5 minutes and been reduced to a nobody. The men who had done the reducing learned to their own alarm that the system contained tools they had not accounted for, tools that could be turned toward truth. They had arrested a nobody, then realized she was their commander. It changed the narrative, but it did not end the work. The battle for institutional integrity had begun in a back room and had moved into daylight. The long fight, the slow and methodical work of accountability would continue. Helena, who had been thrown into the battalion's own backyard like trash, now walked its corridors as a reminder that dignity could be reclaimed, but only with patience, procedure, and public light.
If this story matters to you, share it where others can see it. Tell someone you stand for accountability.